Good evening. Well, when I was talking with Pastor Gary earlier, he was just like on fire. He was like preaching this word. I was like, that dog will hunt. I was like, you should just talk tonight. Like, and isn't it awesome, like, to have a pastor and the whole team, of course, that make all of this possible, who care more about righteousness and the plight of their neighbors and righteousness in the public square, rather than just getting crumbs from the table of secular progressivism so they can keep their 501c3 statuses. It's such a breath of fresh air in a culture of death where the pastors and the shepherds use their staff to scratch and massage their own legs rather than to whack wolves on the top of the head sometimes. Because that's what it means to actually be salt and light. To not just keep your beautiful gospel in your own heart and make yourself feel really good, but to actually do something for your neighbors and to live the full counsel of God in the gospel. And frankly, after the last 3 years that we've been living through, it's wonderful to see a maybe remnant that's starting to rise at a time that our country needs bold men with chests and those who will contend against this culture of death. So I'm so honored to be here. Pastor Jack speaks so kindly of Gary and the entire team here. And I was telling some of my West Coast friends, I'm like, do you know who Gary Hamrick is? Gary Hamrick? They're like, no, who's Gary Hamrick? I'm like, dude, he's the Jack Hibbs of Virginia. What's wrong with you? Like, how do you not know that? Like, they're calling him domestic terrorists. And like Merrick Garland's got his telescope like zoomed in on Cornerstone Chapel. You know, I know we got some mama bears and papa bears in here who spoke at school board meetings, amen? Loudoun County, yeah? And then we learned from Merrick Garland that well, you know, the DHS had to open up an investigation into domestic terrorist activity of mama bears and papa bears speaking at school board meetings. But if you burn down every major Democrat-run city in America, it was mostly peaceful, slightly fiery, mostly peaceful. And I'm starting to ask this question, like, dude, like, how did we get here? Does anyone feel like that? Like, why do men who really want to wear lingerie and read a book to your 6-year-old, they really want to do this. They really want to read a book to your 6-year-old in libraries. And you kind of go like, man, how did we get here? How did we get to the point where it's acceptable to arrest pro-life sidewalk counselors for allegedly blocking the entrance to abortion centers? How did we get to the point to where states are codifying abortion through point of birth and writing it into their state constitutions? I'm a California kid, guys. Governor Gavin Newsom-Leaney and the entire Democrat Party in California has now written abortion through point of birth into the state constitution. It's very similar here in Virginia. And now the push has actually become for infanticide as well. And so California Democrats, my once great home Golden State, has said that they want to prevent investigations into the deaths of babies due to miscarriage, abortion, or perinatal death. So all the California warriors, like my pastor Rob McCoy and Jack Hibbs, made a big stink about this. We went to the Capitol, and we were outside contending for righteousness, saying, don't you know that the word perinatal refers to a child up to 28 days after birth? Why are you so intent on putting that word into the legislation? Because they want to take their pro-choice premises and carry it to its natural conclusion, infanticide. How did this happen? You know, G.K. Chesterton once said that happy is he who knows not only the hidden causes of things, but who has not lost touch with their beginnings. And it's always risky quoting Chesterton in the evening when you're all tired. By the way, if you're not reading Chesterton every week, Christian, are you even living? I'm just saying, like, you know, your first birth was your mother, your second birth was Jesus, your third birth is reading C.S. Lewis and Chesterton for the rest of your life. And you'll come out of that intellectual cave and you will have new eyes through which to see this culture of death. Chesterton, one of the most renowned apologists and voices against eugenics and the evils we're contending with, but in the early 1900s. And he's saying, happy is he who knows how we got here, who understands that ideas have consequences and bad ideas have victims, amen? That ideologies are very, very dangerous because the high priests of humanism have been more zealous for their religion in the public square than the people of God have been for pure and undefiled religion in the public square. Because we've been under the spell of Andy Stanley and Rick Warren and Ed Stetzer, that said, I just preach the gospel and I let the culture burn down around me. As long as I tell people Jesus loves them and he died for them, I can abdicate and fulfill my Pastor Rob McCoy's prophetic warning that the church in America seems to wait downstream to pick up human heartache that they helped create through their political apathy upstream. Are you starting to sense now, church, that there's no such thing as moral neutrality? That when Christians abdicate, evil people take the place and will hold on to those reins of power and influence and wield them for wickedness when we wouldn't for righteousness. So I've been dwelling on, thinking on, and praying on, how did we get here? You know, my friend Charlie Kirk often says that things happen gradually, then suddenly, just like bankruptcy. Right? The guy who goes bankrupt, it's not, how did this happen? Well, there were probably a series of decisions that were made over a period of time. Things happen gradually, then suddenly. I'm here to suggest, brothers and sisters, that the same thing is true culturally and politically. The same thing is true of ideologies. Antonio Gramsci, one of the intellectual fathers of Marxism, who went afoul of Mussolini and spent the rest of his life in prison. Seriously. And he wrote and read voluminously. He read Chesterton's Father Brown series. He reviewed these books, and he writes his prison letters kind of building out his Marxist theories of what the Marxist revolution ought to look like. So then a man named Joseph Buttigieg translates the German letters written by Antonio Gramsci into English and brings them to America. Joseph Buttigieg's son is named Pete Buttigieg. Are you starting to sense the danger of ideas, huh? Yeah, huh? So Antonio Gramsci called it the strategy of the robes, that if we can get the robes of academia, if we can get the robes of the clergy, if we can get the robes of the courts, then we can go onward with the revolution. It's also been called the long walk through the institutions. My point is this: the high priests of the religion of humanism have been far more patient for their liturgy than the people of God have been for theirs. When's the last time Christians fundraised to build a cathedral? That doesn't happen anymore, huh? Try pitching that budget plan to your church. Hey, will you pour in millions over decades and maybe a century to build a beautiful cathedral that will lift our eyes to heaven? Oh, and by the way, the money that you're giving into building that, you'll probably never live to see the results, but maybe your children will. No, we don't do that in the American church anymore. We want immediate gratification. But the leftists that have taken over American institutions have been more religious and dogmatic for their vision than Christians have been for theirs. They have been very patient. All of the rot we're experiencing in America today has been happening gradually for a very, very long time. Now, why should you listen to me? Who the heck am I? Well, I've been a pro-life activist since I was a fetus. No, I'm not joking. I'm half joking. My mother was the director of a pregnancy resource center. Ever heard of those? While pregnant with me. So she was mentoring women and saving babies at risk from being dismembered in the womb while pregnant with me. And I've been told her body, her choice, right? Isn't that the rallying cry? It's just her body. There's no baby. It's pregnancy tissue. So it's just her body. Well, I guess that means, according to the law of transitive properties, if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. So therefore, all parts of my body were actually part of my mother's body, because there's only one body, my mother's, which means that every baby my mother saved from abortion, I saved from abortion, because there was just one body, her body. As Dr. Frankenstein Fauci would tell you, follow the science. Trademark over the E. I feel like Princess Bride sometimes. Like, I don't think that word means what you think it means. You know, it's like, I don't think science means what you think it means anymore. So that's my background. I was homeschooled, obviously. Then I went to public high school, did my senior project on abortion. Whittier High School, Nixon's alma mater in Los Angeles County. They told me, you can't pick the topic of abortion. And I said, here's a copy of the Constitution. You're making me read in government class right now. I will be doing my senior project on the issue of abortion, or you're going to have a lawsuit on your hands. So they backed off real quick. So that's why I love Mike Ferris and ADF and the whole elder team here, right? Wonderful work that they're doing. But that's my background, all right? So I've been sassy since conception, and you haven't seen me sassy yet. But sometimes when I'm with you guys, can I just say this? Sometimes I feel like Bilbo Baggins when I'm with such wonderful people around the country. I don't know half of you half as well as I would like, and I like less than half of you half as well as you deserve. And I just feel that camaraderie and bond with you right now, and I just want to thank you for having me out. So how did we get here? I think much of the rot of the 20th and 21st century can be traced back to some early revolutionaries who had a spiritual and religious vision that they pursued basically to their grave. They were far more dogmatic for their ideas than Christians were for theirs. And one of the high priests of humanism, one of the most misunderstood women of the 20th century, who I will submit to you this evening, whose body count is greater than Stalin, Mao, Hitler, and Mussolini combined, and whose ideology has taken more lives in the 20th century alone than in most of human history before the 20th century combined. And her name is Margaret Sanger, the founder of the American Birth Control League, later renamed Planned Parenthood. We've been fulfilling G.K. Chesterton's prophetic warning when he said, unless a man becomes the enemy of an evil, he will not even become its slave, but rather its champion. I told you, Pastor, I was risking it quoting Chesterton this evening. Some of you are like, I think I got it. Unless a man or a woman becomes the enemy of that evil, he won't even become a slave of the evil he tolerates. He will turn into its champion. What is Chesterton saying? The longer that you tolerate evil in your midst, the longer that you see it and you look at it and you do nothing, the sooner you will become a spiritual degenerate of a theological armchair theologian couch potato who's only good for orthodoxy and not orthopraxy, who pays lip service to what your father cares about but won't contend for what he cares about in the public square. You will turn into an advocate of the very evils that you've been opposing linguistically, but not mobilizing to end in our midst. And aren't we at a late hour of the American culture war? My goodness. And you know that in this area of Virginia, better than most. Ephesians 5:11 says, have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. Let's do that, shall we? Who the heck was Margaret Sanger? She was a Marxist, communist, and socialist. That's where she begins her political vision. She got radicalized in the Socialist Party, the New York labor movement, in Greenwich Village area of New York between 1903 and 1910. And she would have these gatherings, these sort of gatherings of political and cultural elites with lots of money, and they would gather and they would get high off their own intellectual flatulence and massage each other's consciences and feel really good about how they could take over the world with their ideologies. And from those little gatherings came people like the founder of the ACLU and Margaret Sanger. Sanger's belief was that to revolutionize society, you had to break down sexual and societal mores. In other words, that political revolutions require social and interpersonal revolutions. Why? Because if the people are moral, and they're functioning off of that Judeo-Christian worldview that built this republic, and they have a healthy functioning moral compass, if they have virtue and honor, then they'll be immune to the political pipe dreams of would-be tyrants. But if you can break down mores, standards, taboos, virtue, morality, honor, a Christian worldview, and you can get people to indulge every sexual appetite that they have and just feed their belly like an animal. What did C.S. Lewis call it? The abolition of man. He said the head rules the belly through the chest, meaning intellect rules raw appetite through virtue, honor, and morality. So men without chests is men without virtue, honor, and morality, so the head rules the belly with nothing to temper it in between. In other words, you become a more cunning devil. Your intellect rules what you want with nothing to temper it in between. That's where Sanger kind of begins her premises and presuppositions to usher in the Marxist revolution. In other words, she understood that to usher in the social revolution, you had to start with the sexual revolution. So she starts titillating the masses, distributing birth control, writing very sexually explicit writings, encouraging people to cheat on their spouses, to indulge any appetite that they have. If it feels good, do it. She's one of the architects of the sexual revolution. So please do not think that the founder of Planned Parenthood was just the birth control gal. She just wanted to help minority poor families plan their parenthood. No, she had far more dogmatic and sinister motivations and premises. So she writes her first published paper in 1914 called Woman Rebel, with the tagline, "No gods and no masters." Does that sound political, or does that sound like pretty religious? No gods and no masters. What if I told you that's just another way of saying I'm God? Eat the apple, because when you do, then your eyes shall be opened. So Eve got woke. And then ye shall be as gods. Aleister Crowley, the very famous Satanist, rapist of children and white supremacist, summed up all the law and the prophets of Satanism to the phrase, "Do as thou wilt." Feed the belly. If it feels good, do it. That's where the founder of Planned Parenthood begins her premises and her revolutionary takeover. So in her first book, or paper, she says, rebel women claim the following rights. And check out this slide. I think you guys will like this one. The right to be lazy, the right to be an unmarried mother, the right to destroy, and the right to love. Her publications on contraception, the sexual liberation movement, she defended the need for political assassinations. They end up getting her indicted on 3 counts for breaking the Comstock laws in New York City, which allowed the Postal Service to go into the mail and remove pornographic, sexually lewd material. Rather than getting arrested, the founder of Planned Parenthood ships her kids off to be raised by someone else. She has her socialist friends in the New York labor movement forge her a passport, and she flees to England for 18 months. This is actually where she gets her beginning. And her 18 months in England, she gets more radicalized than she was by the socialists in New York City. And she meets the Neo-Malthusians. Now, anyone ever heard of Malthusianism? By raise of hands, or Neo-Malthusianism? Ever heard of, there's too many people on planet Earth, so the sun god's really angry at us. Well, Thomas Malthus was the first Bill Gates. He was the first George Soros, Klaus Schwab, whatever. By the way, you know that Bill Gates' dad sat on the board of Planned Parenthood? You'll start noticing how the abortion industry and the overpopulation movement were the same movement. So she meets the Neo-Malthusians, which refers to Thomas Malthus, the first overpopulationist. And Thomas Malthus wrote in the late 1700s to early 1800s that there's too many people on planet Earth. And food production can't keep up with population growth. So we got to do something about that. Well, so you get to decide who lives and who dies. You get to decide who to sterilize and who to allow to have kids and who to not to allow to have kids. Because if we don't, Mother Gaia is going to scream for our heads. The sun monster is really angry at us. And so if you want to save planet Earth, just give me all your political rights so I can solve the climate catastrophe. Isn't it always convenient that the climate catastrophe, while their predictions never come true, they always demand you giving them all of their political rights to solve the impending doom, and then it never materializes? Just kind of fascinating how that always pans out that way. So Thomas Malthus was the first overpopulationist. So here's what Thomas Malthus believed. I'm telling you this because Hosea 4:6 says, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. So I'm trying to make sure you're not destroyed. Okay, that sound good? So here's Thomas Malthus. All children born beyond what would be required to keep up the population to a desired level must necessarily perish, unless room be made for them by the deaths of grown persons. Therefore, we should facilitate, instead of foolishly and vainly endeavoring to impede the operations of nature in producing this mortality. And if we dread the too frequent form of the visitation of the horrid form of famine, we should sedulously encourage the other forms of destruction which we compel nature to use. Instead of recommending cleanliness to the poor, we should encourage contrary habits. What a demon, huh? In our towns, we should make the streets more narrow, crowd more people into the houses to court the return of the plague. In the country, we should build our villages near stagnant pools and encourage settlements in all marshy and unwholesome situations. But above all, we should reprobate specific remedies, meaning stop remedies for ravaging diseases, and restrain those benevolent but much mistaken people, Christians, who thought they were doing a service to mankind by projecting schemes for the total extirpation of particular disorders. Can I summarize that for you? Some people are good and some people are bad. We need more of the good people and less of the bad people. The bad people tend to be the poor and darker of skin and the criminal classes and the alcoholics and the mentally and physically disabled. We don't really like them to have kids. They have bad genes. We think they're ugly and disgusting. Nick Vujicic, my brother, life without limbs, no arms, no legs, one of the most wonderful brothers I know. Yeah, people like that, they shouldn't be allowed to have kids, but rich white people and people with good genes, they should be allowed to have kids. So neo-Malthusianism, referring to Thomas Malthus, leads naturally to eugenics, doesn't it? Did you know the root word in eugenics means good in birth? Which means what? Some people are not good in birth. And so we get, as the high priest of humanism, we get to decide who should have kids and who shouldn't. You want to know how deadly and dangerous ideologies are? You want me to prove to you that ideas have consequences and bad ideas have victims? All right, let me prove it to you. Ever heard the name Paul Ehrlich? Ever heard of the name of the book, The Population Bomb? I heard a woke brother over here. An awakened brother over here say, yep, that's a son of Issachar over there, a man who understands the times. The Population Bomb, written in 1964-65, and he parrots the same ideas from Thomas Malthus in the late 1700s by saying what? If we don't significantly curb overpopulation in the next 20 to 30 years, we're going to have massive starvation all over the world. There won't be enough resources. Millions of people will die. So give me all your political rights to solve the impending population bomb. That was the name of the book, The Population Bomb. Paul Ehrlich sat on the board of Planned Parenthood. Of course he did. Within 30 years of the writing of that book, the world population had doubled, malnutrition was at all-time low, and we were the fattest generation in American history. Follow the science. Science. Well, yeah, Paul Ehrlich thought he was following the science. So do you see how deadly those ideologies are? From Thomas Malthus's time to 1964, and Paul Ehrlich's book incited international policy adjustments. You had Indira Gandhi, the Prime Minister of India, start linking access to food, water, and medical care to their sterilization status. Because they were buying these lies about overpopulation. We got to sterilize the masses. And then, of course, China's one-child policy, which only resulted in millions of murdered babies and millions of forcibly sterilized mothers. Yeah, ideas have consequences. And bad ideas have victims. So she meets the neo-Malthusians, Margaret Sanger. This is her political journey to becoming a revolutionary. And then she meets a man named Havelock Ellis. Has anyone ever heard of the name Alfred Kinsey? Good, all righty. I don't have time to dive into it right now, and there's some kids in the audience. I don't know if I really want to explain to you who that was, but there's the Kinsey Institute at Indiana University. He was a pornographic, sexually addicted demon, and I really shouldn't go any deeper than that. Okay, Havelock Ellis was England's Alfred Kinsey. He was one of the architects of the sexual revolution. He wrote over 50 books on every lewd form of sexual experimentation. He himself was impotent, so he was always trying to find new ways to get excited. That's the PG-13 version. Havelock Ellis. Guess who begins an affair with Havelock Ellis? Margaret Sanger. Ever heard of H.G. Wells? Yep, she had an affair with him. But Sanger sleeps her way up the levers of power in England, okay? Now, Havelock Ellis was a rabid eugenicist. His single greatest mentor and influence was a man named Francis Galton. Francis Galton is the modern father of the eugenics movement. And he coined the term eugenics. Francis Galton coins the term eugenics. He's the single greatest influence and mentor on Havelock Ellis, who's the single greatest political and sexual influence on Margaret Sanger. Francis Galton had a half-cousin, Charles Darwin. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Darwinism, survival of the fittest, might makes right in the religion of humanism. There's no sanctity of life. There's no image of God. There's no human dignity. Your God's a joke. You are no more valuable than the dog, the cat, the cow. Human beings are not exceptional. We're just an evolved form of animals and apes. Therefore, might makes right. The strong will kill the weak. Welcome to the animal kingdom. Darwinism. By the way, did you know Charles Darwin was like a rabid white supremacist? Did anyone know that? He was like hated black people. He was a total disgusting dude. Shocker. Charles Darwin, his cousin is Francis Galton, who modernizes his cousin's ideas into the eugenics movement and coins the term eugenics, who mentors Havelock Ellis, one of the architects of the sexual revolution in England, who becomes the single greatest political and sexual influence on the founder of Planned Parenthood. And today, Planned Parenthood is the largest, best funded, and most profitable nonprofit in world history. The Leviathan. She comes back to America in 1916, and she launches a brilliant public relations campaign to get the charges against her dropped. She doesn't go to jail, and she opens up her first illegal birth control clinic in the Brown section of New York, an area heavily populated by those she deemed unfit to live, blacks, Slavs, Italians, and Jews. The authorities shut down the clinic within 2 weeks, because it was illegal then. She spent 30 days in the workhouse, and immediately upon being released, she founds her magazine, The Birth Control Review, in 1917, The Birth Control Review. Then in 1921, she launched the American Birth Control League, later renamed Planned Parenthood. So she started with publishing ideas, and she'd invite her eugenicist friends from around the world to write their articles, sharing their ideas in her magazine. And to read some of these articles today is just scandalous. I mean, that's why we made her look like a demon, by the way. But then, when St. George Floyd and the high priests of the religion of humanism began to run the country in 2020, Planned Parenthood started getting charges of systemic racism from the left, which is always hilarious. By the way, the left will always eat their own. That is how the revolution goes, by the way. So, after decades of whitewashing their founder's legacy and saying that she wasn't really a eugenicist or a racist, they wiped her name off of the New York City Margaret Sanger Planned Parenthood clinic, acknowledging that their founder was kind of a demon. But that Planned Parenthood clinic in New York still sits on the corner of a square called the Margaret Sanger Square. Yeah, ideas have consequences. It should not surprise you that New York City is the most dangerous place today for an unborn child to find themselves. And that's where she got her beginning. That's where Planned Parenthood is launched. Would you like to know some of the things she said about people? So she wrote a book in 1922 called The Pivot of Civilization. Let's do this quickly. Eugenics without birth control seems to us a house built upon the sands. It is at the mercy of the rising streams of the unfit. So what did she just tell you, church? Birth control was a tool to accomplish the aims of eugenics. We're trying to build this house to only let fit people come in and kick the unfit people out, but the house keeps collapsing in on itself because we're building it on the sand. So to build it on the solid rock foundation, we got to build it through eugenics. Eugenics without birth control, she says, is a house doomed to fail. So she's telling you what I told you a few minutes ago. She wasn't just about birth control. It was a tool to be wielded to accomplish her more sinister aims of eugenics, to determine who should have kids and who shouldn't, who should live and who should die. Her organization was originally housed in the same office spaces as the American Eugenics Society. They shared office spaces. Oh, and by the way, they shared all of the same multimillionaire donors because they were the same movement. Here we go. Oh, here was her goal in her book, to create a race of thoroughbreds by encouraging more children from the fit and less from the unfit. By the way, that is the language of eugenicists. Anytime you hear the word fit and unfit, unwanted and wanted, undesirables, or to quote the Nazis, useless eaters, that's the language of eugenicists. So she said the most urgent problem today is how to limit and discourage the over-fertility of the mentally and physically defective. I forgot to tell Pastor Gary to distribute barf bags when you walked in this evening. I always forget to do that. So here's the problem as she put it at her 1925 birth control conference in New York City. She said, the government of the United States deliberately encourages and even makes necessary by its laws the breeding with a breakneck rapidity of idiots, defectives, diseased, feeble-minded, and criminal classes. Billions of dollars are expensed by our state and federal governments and by those private charities and philanthropies for the care, the maintenance, and the perpetuation of these classes. Year by year, more money is expensed to maintain an increasing race of morons, which literally threatens the foundations of our civilization. One more. Here was the problem as she saw it. Why did she build the American Birth Control League? She told us in her book, it's the dullard, the gawk, the numbskull, the simpleton, and the weakling are amongst us. They're even breeding. Inordinately prolific, literally threatening to overwhelm the world with their useless and terrifying gift. Yeah, do you see now why Planned Parenthood wouldn't acknowledge the legacy and history of their founders' ideas? All right, anyone ready for the racism? So in 1939, she founds the Negro Project. I didn't call it that, she called it that. The Negro Project in 1939. Here's the proposal. Isn't it great that they wrote all this stuff down for us? So you can go fact check Washington Post, Democracy Dies in Darkness, 10 Pinocchios on all this stuff, all right? Here's how she put it in her Negro Project. The mass of Negroes, particularly in the South, they're still breeding carelessly and disastrously, with the result that the increase among Negroes, even more than among those whites, is from that portion of the population least intelligent and fit. What? But when Hillary Clinton got the Margaret Sanger Award, she said she was proud to be recognized alongside a woman with such a prolific vision. So, if that was the proposal, what was the goal? You ready for the goal of Sanger's Negro Project? The gradual suppression, elimination, and eventual extinction of defective stocks, those human weeds, which threatened the blossoming of the finest flowers of American civilization. Guys, she's not talking about flora. She's talking about human beings, image bearers of God, as defective stalks and human weeds. Of course, the rich white people, they were the finest flowers that we had to bloom and water. So she had to get colored ministers on board to be the face of the Negro Project, to deflect criticisms of racism because of her overtly racist and eugenicist language. So she starts hiring colored ministers and charismatic social leaders to be the front of the campaign, not because I tell you so, but because she tells you so. Here's a letter she wrote to Dr. Clarence Gamble. We propose to hire 3 or 4 colored ministers, preferably with social service backgrounds and with engaging personalities. The most successful approach to the Negro is through a religious appeal, because we do not want word to get out that we want to exterminate the Negro population. And the minister, the pastor, he's the one who can straighten out that idea if it occurs to any more of his rebellious members. As my friend, Pastor John Amanchukwu, who has ministered here, says, I'm a rebellious Negro, baby. And I'm going to warn my black brothers and sisters against your demonic and eugenicist goals and aims. You guys love Pastor John Amanchukwu, by the way. Wasn't he incredible? So, as it was in 1939, so it is today. Where most of the all-black churches, not all but most, in America are simply religious tools of the Democrat Party to deflect criticisms of their deeper eugenicist aims and to uplift the very political party that has made it their goal to fulfill Margaret Sanger's vision. So Sanger has to hire field coordinators. This is a little bit of a big vision, huh? So she has to hire local coordinators in New York to propagandize birth control to the people she doesn't want reproducing. And they wrote down their ideas for us too. She hired Negro Project directors and coordinators. Here's what one of them said. Get ready for this. Is going to rip your face off, okay? I'll give you the citations. You go fact check me. You ready for this? There is a great danger that we will fail because the Negroes think that this is a plan for their extermination. Hence, let's appear to let the colored run it. What? In other words, you know that you're a racist, demonic bigot, but you want to put black people at the face of it to simply be a tool to deflect criticisms of your overtly obvious demonic aims, and onward with the revolution. Which is why Lecrae and Jackie Hill Perry and T.D. Jakes are fulfilling the role that Margaret Sanger planned for them. Here's one other Negro Project director. I wonder if Southern darkies can ever be entrusted with a clinic. Now pause. Who calls black people Southern darkies? Racists. Okay. Our experience causes us to doubt their ability to work, except under white supervision. End quote. One of the hires that Margaret Sanger employed as a Negro Project director. Anyone disturbed yet? You guys awake? Did you have a latte before service like I did? Oh my gosh. Number one response I've gotten from wonderful brothers and sisters, godly men and women at faithful churches on this tour has been, Seth, I've never heard any of that before. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Margaret's dream was being fulfilled. Here's how she wrote about her dream in her book. Discouraging the defective and diseased elements of humanity from their reckless and irresponsible swarming and spawning. It sounds like she's talking about breeding dogs. She once said that birth control appeals to the advanced radical because it is calculated to undermine the authority of the Christian church. You guys not awake? Did you not hear that one? The founder of Planned Parenthood just say, birth control appeals to the advanced radical because it is calculated to undermine the authority of the Christian church. What did I tell you 30 minutes ago? That she wasn't just the birth control gal. That was a tool to be wielded to unlock the revolution. Because those Christians, they're being told to be fruitful and multiply. They're being told to exercise dominion, to fill the earth and subdue it. And nothing is a greater threat to our Marxist utopian takeover than the bride of Christ. Oh, for pastors who would recognize that today. She starts inviting board members. I don't have time to get into all of it. She had a board member who is a high official of the Massachusetts Ku Klux Klan that was once described as one of the spiritual fathers of Nazi Germany. His name was Lothrop Stoddard. She had a friend named Madison Grant, one of the leaders of the American Eugenics Society. Madison Grant once put a black man in a cage with a monkey at the New York City Bronx Zoo to, quote, illustrate evolution. That man's name was Oda Banga, and he took his life 10 years later. Madison Grant got a letter in the mail one day from a German corporal recently out of prison and rising in the German political scene, thanking Madison Grant for his writings on eugenics and calling Madison Grant's book his Bible. The man who wrote those letters was named Adolf Hitler. Margaret Sanger had a friend named Eugen Fisher who spoke at one of her population birth control conferences. Eugen Fisher had run a concentration camp in German-controlled Southwest Africa prior to World War I, where he starved, experimented on, and murdered Native Africans, and then was invited to speak at Sanger's birth control conference. She had an advisor and a friend named Ernst Rudin, who wrote in her birth control review. Do you remember her magazine where she wrote in her ideas? He wrote a piece in there called Eugenic Sterilization, because you got to sterilize some people for eugenic goals because they shouldn't be allowed to have kids. Ernst Rudin was a personal advisor to Sanger, and at the time he wrote that piece in 1933 in her birth control review, he was serving as none other than the director of the Society for Racial Hygiene under Adolf Hitler. So those were some of her friends. Okay. 100 years ago, following the science meant being a eugenicist. Eugenics was dominating American states as well, and you probably know this because in 1927, Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, in an 8-1 decision in Buck versus Bell, upheld the 1924 Virginia law that mandated the sterilization of those defined as unfit to reproduce in this state. And in 1927, Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, a political progressive and eugenicist, summed up the science of his day in that Supreme Court decision when he said, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. So eugenics wasn't just a Germany thing. It was very much had sway in America as well. One of the only men to see all of this in the early 1900s as Sanger is taking off was a man named G.K. Chesterton. And with almost unparalleled political vision and prescience, G.K. Chesterton wrote in an English newspaper in 1920. Now, when did I tell you Sanger launched the American Birth Control League, later renamed Planned Parenthood? 1921. So 1 year before the organization that would bear the name Planned Parenthood was founded, Chesterton writes one sentence in an English newspaper in 1920. And he says, "We are not so very far off from even the sacrifice of babies. If not to a crocodile, at least to a creed." The creed of eugenics, the creed of neo-Malthusianism, the creed of humanism, the creed of overpopulationism, the creed of Darwinism. And G.K. Chesterton to this day is credited as one of the only men in the early 1900s to see all of this happening and to warn people where it was going. And yet Planned Parenthood wouldn't start performing abortions in a major way until the 60s. So he knew before they knew where their ideology would take them. Yeah, ideas have consequences, and bad ideas have victims. So as we wind down this evening, I want to tell you a story because it's been burning in my chest for some time now, and I believe it's divinely inspired by the Lord for such a time as this. You see, those who forget the lessons of history are indeed doomed to repeat them. And we all know the name William Wilberforce. We all know the name Oskar Schindler. We all know the name Dietrich Bonhoeffer. But there were 2 young people in Munich, Germany in 1941 and 1942 who were facing the same ideology that we are today. Because, church, when you detach human dignity, the imago Dei, the right to life, from simply being human, there's no limiting principle to that demonic ideology. Does that make sense? When being human is no longer enough to have dignity and a right to life, then what will ground those rights? Whatever litmus test for personhood the high priests of humanism randomly create in order to deny rights to those who pose a threat to their political agenda. So these young people were facing the same ideology that Chesterton was facing, that we're facing. It was the Jews then, it's babies now, and now you're very close to living through the next iteration of eugenics, as the White House describes pro-life conservative Christians as domestic terrorists and the greatest and most extreme threat to freedom and democracy. To quote Joe Biden's USSR red blood backdrop disgusting speech, of the most disgusting speech of any president in American political history, bar none. In 1942, a young woman named Sophie Scholl was walking the streets of Munich, Germany, and she had a beautiful relationship with the Lord. She was a strong Christian. Her father spent some time in jail for publicly criticizing Hitler. And she picks up this paper on the sidewalk in Munich, and it says, "Leaflets of the White Rose." She starts reading this, and it's explicitly condemning the crimes of the Nazis and asking the good people to wake up. She's like, whoa. Her heart stirred to action. She's reading this. You know what she's thinking? My brother Hans talks like this at dinner a lot. He could have written this. Come to find out, the White Rose Resistance had not only been co-founded, but was being run by none other than her older brother Hans on the left, who at 24 years old was just trying to protect his little sister. He knew how dangerous political resistance was to the Third Reich in 1942. Guys, 1942, the Jews have been wearing the yellow star for 2.5 years. The ashes of burned Jews are already falling on the steeples of local churches whose pastors won't preach the full counsel of God and mobilize their congregations for righteousness, which led Dietrich Bonhoeffer to label them cheap grace, syncretistic Christians. Well, she demands to join the White Rose Resistance. Sophie Scholl, at 21 years old, becomes the youngest and the only female of the White Rose Resistance in Munich, Germany. Although her bravery spawned other chapters around Germany. So these 20-somethings start staying up all night writing, printing, and distributing anti-Nazi leaflets all around Germany. And they would say things in these leaflets like, if you know, why do you not act? Yeah, it sometimes is that simple, church. They would say things like, we are the White Rose Resistance, we are your bad conscience, and we will not leave you alone. Then they would take trains in the middle of the night to major German cities and drop off their leaflets everywhere. It was a social media campaign pre-digital age. Have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. Do you not see? Why will you not act? On February 18th, 1943, they took things to a whole nother level. And Hans and Sophie, brother and sister, walked onto the campus at the University of Munich during class time when the halls were quiet. And Sophie said, I should be the one to carry the briefcase full of our illegal leaflets, because I'll be the least likely to be apprehended and searched. And they start dropping off piles of their illegal leaflets all around the University of Munich, which you can visit today. And then in this iconic act, Sophie walks to the third floor balcony of the University of Munich, and she throws an entire stack of leaflets down to the atrium below. The janitor, a committed Nazi, catches Hans and Sophie in the act, calls the Gestapo, and has them arrested on February 18th, 1943, so 80 years ago last month. And those are their mugshots, taken 80 years ago last month. Because they were arrested on February 18th, 1943, they missed a meeting that they were supposed to show up to that afternoon in Munich with a man named Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the founder of the Confessing Church, who was hung naked at Flossenburg prison on April 9th, 1945 for his involvement in the failed Valkyrie assassination attempt on the life of Adolf Hitler. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who would famously say before he was hung, "This is the end, for me, the beginning of life." Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who went back to Union Theological Seminary in New York City for a few months to avoid the tyranny of the Nazis and the Third Reich, and returned to Germany rather than remaining comfortable in New York City, and famously said, "I will have no right to participate in the reconstruction of Christian life in Germany after the war if I do not share the trials of these times with my people," who had come to Munich to meet with Hans and Sophie on February 18th, 1943. They never made that meeting. For the next 4 days, this 21-year-old and this 24-year-old were brutally interrogated, physically abused, and they refused to implicate any of their other friends or members of the White Rose Resistance. Unfortunately, they found incriminating evidence, and their friend Christoph Probst was arrested the same day, whose wife was in the hospital recovering from childbirth. All in their 20s. It was as if God would enter the cell room of Hans and Sophie and pick them up into his hands. And Sophie spoke with a level of moral and spiritual clarity and courage that was lost on most German pulpits. Sophie is speaking prophetically to us today, church, to remind us a simple truth. Evil people do evil things. Stop complaining about it. Stop yelling at Tucker Carlson on the television and saying, "Why are they transing the kids? Why are they killing the babies?" Evil people do really bad things. Displace Christianity, and kooky, weird religions like humanism take its place. Get used to it, church. Stop blaming the doers of evil and start looking at ourselves. So, Sophie said something towards the end of her life, days before she was taken to the guillotine. And it's the message for the American church and the blood-bought bride of Christ in America today. How did we get here is the question I started this evening with. And maybe let's now answer the question, how do we get out? Well, let a 21-year-old filled with the Holy Spirit give you the answer. The real damage The real damage is actually caused by all of those millions out there who just want to survive. The honest men and women who just want to be left in peace, yeah? Those who don't want their little lives disturbed by anything bigger than themselves, those with no sides and no causes. Those who won't take measure of their own strength for fear of antagonizing their own weaknesses. Ooh, that dog will hunt. Those who don't like to make waves or enemies. Those for whom freedom, honor, truth, and principle, it's just literature, just words. Those who live small, die small. It's the reductionistic approach to life, church. If you keep it small, you'll keep it under control. If you don't make any noise, the boogeyman won't find you. FBI, Department of Homeland Security. But it's all an illusion because they die too. Those people who roll up their spirits into tiny little balls so as to be safe. Safe. Safe? From what? Life is always on the edge of death. Narrow streets, they lead to the same place as wide avenues. And a little candle burns itself out just like the flaming torch does. I choose my own way to burn. All right, we need to ask a question. Who talks like that at 21? Oh my gosh, it sounds like Churchill or Chesterton. Sounds like C.S. Lewis. A young woman with the lion of the tribe of Judah roaring inside of her. To say, get onto the battlefield for your king. Get comfortable with being uncomfortable. Stand in a day like today. Be obedient, for obedience is better than sacrifice. And watch how I'll move through you. So, right before she gets taken to the guillotine, on February 22nd, 1943, according to her cellmate, Sophie looks out of her window with bars on it. And she says, how can we expect righteousness to prevail when there's hardly anyone willing to give themselves up individually to a righteous cause? Such a fine sunny day it is, and I have to go now. But what does my death matter if through us thousands of people are awakened and stirred to action? Well, brothers and sisters, they never saw thousands awakened and stirred to action. The church remained asleep in Germany and nothing changed. And according to the executioner, as Sophie's neck was laid on the chopping block, before the blade fell, her final words were, "The sun still shines." The executioner was later interviewed, and he said he had never seen someone meet his end as she did. And Hans's final words were simply, freedom, freedom. Brothers and sisters, while rose blossoms may perish in the fall, they reappear in the spring, amen. So while all of the members of the White Rose Resistance were found and executed, their sacrifice has planted the seeds of resistance in the hearts of millions whose actions will keep alive the legacy of the White Rose. And your sacrifice, church, will water those seeds of resistance. So one day, thousands will be awakened and stirred to action. The White Rose will blossom again. And we, as the blood-bought bride of Christ, can say, the sun still shines. So brothers and sisters, I am rebuilding the White Rose Resistance for this generation against our silent but far more deadly holocaust of abortion, to build the army of Christian godly resistance that Hans and Sophie dreamed of but never saw realized, to end our holocaust of abortion today before it's too late. I won't take any more of your time. Let me just tell you, my pastor Rob McCoy calls me the Charlie Kirk of the pro-life movement. I'm not bragging. I'm telling you, I've been sassy since conception, and I'm trying to build the Turning Point USA of the pro-life movement to be a stick in the eye, a pain in the rear, and a fly in the ointment to the abortion industrial complex, the culture of death, the spirit of the age, and his obsession with wiping out the image of God from the earth. This culture war that we have been tolerating for decades, it was simply a proxy war for a far deeper spiritual war Abortion is Satan's pride and joy. It's his core sacrament. And if this is part of your story, I'm simply here this evening to say, I'm not here to shame and condemn you. I want God to heal and redeem you from your prior abortion so you can stand in the middle of this culture of death, healed and redeemed, and be like Gideon and David and Jonathan, and stand in the middle of the road of the culture of death with a big sign that says, stop, you will go no further. Jeff Bezos' ex-wife made a $250 million donation to Planned Parenthood last year. That's what we're contending against. I have a few years here to build a multi-million-dollar nonprofit so that I need full-time security around my home in 5 years because of the problem that our organization is to Planned Parenthood and the culture of death. As we rebuild Christendom, we're welcoming you into the White Rose Resistance. So if you want to join the White Rose Resistance, scan the QR code. We're asking people to pray about $35 a month. How about that? $35 a month. That's how we're building the White Rose Resistance, to be like Elijah at the prophets of Baal and walk up to those high priests of child sacrifice and say, where is your God? Is he pooping? And publicly mock the spirit of Baal in the public square. Hold up that head of Goliath when we've chopped it off and give glory to God. Brothers and sisters, I'll see you on the battlefield. Now go out there and give him heaven, will you?